Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 599, Ain't It Grand? One of the things I enjoy about history, one of the reasons I love thinking about it so much, is that in my experience, it's not that hard to understand people's motivations. When you take the time to really understand another time and another place, to think about what we know of its systems and structures, it's usually pretty straightforward to figure out why a given person or group of people behaved as they did. Humans respond to incentives, after all. Once you understand the incentives, it's pretty straightforward to understand human choices. Don't get it twisted, you'll never catch me agreeing with, say, the premise advanced by a lot of economists that humans are fundamentally rational creatures. I don't think that's true at all. But generally, we are at least comprehensible, if you take the time to try and think about things from a perspective that's not yours. But of course, every so often, something comes along that shakes your nice, simple understanding of these things and forces you to consider that maybe even comprehensibility might be too generous a bar when it comes to human action. Anyone who's read a good amount of history has probably come across at least one or two WTF moments, so to speak, in their time. One of my own first and biggest ones came late in my undergraduate years when I was working on my honors thesis. Said thesis was focused on the evolution of Japanese martial arts, especially kendo, during the Meiji period, through the assimilation of ideas from Western sporting culture. It was a really good project that forced me to cover a lot of ground and read pretty widely, and in doing so, I came across a lot of things that kind of surprised me. And one that really stood out was a discovery that apparently in the final years of feudalism in Japan during the late 1860s, there'd been some sort of mass movement among the commoners that just involved singing and dancing and running around in strange outfits, and generally behavior that, at a minimum, would read as pretty weird to most. These protests, movements, religious experiences, some mix of all of those, the main unifying thread across them was that they all began with a report that some sort of divine amulet had fallen from the sky. And I remember distinctly sitting in my little desk at the top of the university library as I read about this as an aside in some textbook or another, thinking, wait, what? Did I misread that? Have I been in here too long and I'm finally losing it? Did I ever really have it in the first place? I spent a good amount of time trying to dig into this whole thing before ultimately realizing that, strictly speaking, it wasn't actually useful for what I was trying to talk about, and I should probably, prioritize actually finishing my work instead. But the whole thing stuck with me. I've always been curious about this moment. And as I encountered some of the stories in Komei's world that we spent the last few weeks talking about, I decided now is finally the time. So this week, we're going to take a look at the Eijanaika movement and what it, often treated as a sideshow to the big dramas of the collapse of feudalism, can teach us about the final years of feudal Japan. So first things first, the phrase itself, Eijanaika, which became the name of this movement, so to speak, because it's what people engaged in it, or at least some of them, would supposedly repeatedly shout. In modern Japanese, this phrase would be pronounced Iijanaika, and indeed, some of the outside observers to this, like Englishman Sir Ernst Mason Sato, transcribed it as such in their records of the event. I am, as I have said many times before, not an expert on the history of language, but it's my understanding that Japanese around this time was going through a bit of a pronunciation shift that was then exacerbated by the standardization of the language in the next few decades under the new national government. Part of that shift involved the relationship between the and e sounds. I really don't know enough here to say. I just want to note that if you've studied Japanese and you're like, what the hell is Eijanaika? It's just Iijanaika, as in good. So a literal translation of Iijanaika would be something like, ain't it great or ain't it grand? However, like a lot of Japanese phrases, there's some contextual ambiguity, and the meaning, of course, can shift depending on how you use it. If, as a lot of the members of this movement were, you were violating some sort of social taboo with your actions, Eijanaika might read as something like, why not, or who cares, or even a somewhat spicier translation, F it. The term came to be associated with this specific moment because in the summer of 1867 there were a spate of communal dances, parades, protests, some combination, that spread across Japan starting, most scholars usually agree, in Mikawa province, what's now the eastern half of Aichi prefecture along the Pacific coast, in the 7th lunar month of 1867. From there they spread along the nation's road networks both to the east and to west, reaching Edo and Kyoto late in 1867. The last recorded Eijanaika outbreaks were in Tajima, Harima, and Tango provinces, what's now Hyogo prefecture just west of Osaka, and the western part of Kyoto prefecture, in the 3rd and 4th lunar months of 1868. And again, in Western Japan in particular, these moments were associated with the chanting of this phrase, Eijanaika. Notably, the phrase is not as associated with outbursts in Central or Eastern Japan, but it's become a sort of catch-all designation for the whole thing. So what exactly were people saying, "who cares," about? Well, let's quickly refresh ourselves on some context here. After 1853, when American warships first forced the shoguns of the Tokugawa family to sign treaties opening Japan to foreign trade, Japan became increasingly unstable, and much of that instability was triggered by the arrival of the foreigners themselves. Certainly, having a bunch of strangers force your country to sign treaties at gunpoint is the sort of thing that tends to make an impression on people. So too did the fact that these treaties forced the economy open to foreign trade, which destabilized prices and resulted in a crisis of affordability around everything from food to textiles. Even if you never directly interacted with these foreigners, which was very likely unless you lived in one of the new trade ports now open to them, the foreign trade probably was not doing much to improve your life. And that was without taking into account centuries of propaganda about evil foreigners who all practiced sorcery in service to their dark religion of Christianity, which had been banned in Japan for over 2 centuries at this point, and had taken on a reputation that was almost cartoonishly evil in popular stories. It's kinda hard to imagine from a modern perspective, but consider what that must have been like. You've been told all your life that these people are horrific, evil wizards and that their religion is a literal offense to the cosmic order, and now suddenly they're being allowed into the country en masse. That'll do a number on you. Of course, the problems of the 1850s and 1860s were not, in fact, solely because of the new foreign menace. The Tokugawa system had some pretty deep political and social problems by this point, and the foreign crisis only exacerbated those issues. It did not create them. At its core, of course, the status system itself was a big burden for the entire social structure. Samurai felt some of that burden. Across the country, leadership roles were held not by people of talent, but by those who had inherited leadership from their ancestors, and who as a result were often profoundly incompetent. Not for nothing did the phrase daimyo no ge, the skills of a feudal lord, become a way of referring to someone who had no talent whatsoever. All these people had not done a day's work to earn their position in their entire lives, and frustration at being locked out of positions that lower-ranking samurai felt, not incorrectly, they were more deserving of, helped radicalize a great many of them. Those lower-ranking samurai would in turn end up supporting the overthrow of the system in large numbers. But the thing was, even a frustrated low-rank samurai was still, well, a samurai. By virtue of that status, unless they were literally at the bottom rung of warrior society, they still had certain privileges that were the envy of all other social classes, who, lest we forget, made up the vast majority of actual society. Samurai, of course, had their guaranteed stipends. Even if the stipends were being reduced throughout this period, nobody else got free handouts just by virtue of existing. Samurai enjoyed social privileges like the right to wear weapons in public and demand some degree of deference from commoners. The character of the bloodthirsty samurai haughtily strutting around testing his sword on the first commoner to look at him funny is, of course, more of a fiction than a reflection of actual reality, because samurai were expected to be Confucian gentlemen living up to standards of good behavior, and lording it over the commoners was a little gauche. But of course it was undeniable that samurai simply had more privilege than everybody else. Beyond the stipends and the weapons, there were the sumptuary laws, which banned non-samurai from wearing certain cuts and types of clothing, the family compounds that warriors received in neighborhoods and castle towns where only they were allowed to live, the access to schools run by their feudal lords where everyone else had to actually pay for an education. It was a lot, the sort of thing that would easily breed resentment, and that was before you factored in the corruption, because, oh lord, was corruption an issue. I mean, of course it was. There weren't really any structural checks on the power of feudal officials, except for being watched by someone higher ranked than them, and given that all those higher ranking people were picked, again, based on birth, rather than, say, knowing anything about how administration works, that's not a recipe for an effective watchdog. It was true the samurai bureaucrats of the Tokugawa system were enjoined constantly to be gentlemen, to live up to Confucian ideals of utter selflessness and do only what was best for the people. But there was no systemic way to actually ensure they did that, so you were relying on the innate moral sense of your bureaucrats, and of course, that went about as well as you would expect. As a result, corruption was simply a fact of life during the Edo period. Kawai Kome, as we've seen, talks about it as an issue in Wakayama, particularly in 1853, when the rise of a new faction around the young feudal lord of the domain led to a shakeup in domain leadership and a sweeping corruption investigation that ended up targeting hundreds of samurai with administrative roles in the domain government. But those sorts of investigations only targeted people associated with the previous faction of leadership. Honestly, they were pretty explicitly intended to entrench a new faction using corruption as an excuse, not to actually, do anything about corruption. One of the more famous critics of the late Tokugawa system, the anonymous author known as Buyo Inshi, wrote in his scathing account of life in the early 1800s that corruption was an issue everywhere, from the Buddhist priesthood to the administration of the law. And it's worth noting, for men like Buyo Inshi, who we know was a male samurai who lived in Edo, what's now Tokyo, corruption was fundamentally an issue of both personal and social morality, which in the Confucian worldview that dominated this time were fundamentally the same thing. You see, one of the core conceits of Confucianism is the idea that those higher on the social ladder have an obligation to be gentlemen, junzi in Chinese, kunshi in Japanese, who lead by example. Their moral leadership, so the thinking went, inspired those lower on the social pyramid, creating a harmonious society, and the privileges and perks of leadership were a reward for that moral leadership. Thus, if you were a Confucian like Buyo Inshi, the corruption and moral failings of society were the result of the corruption and moral failing of its leaders. It must be the failure of leadership that brings about the corruption of the age. And while Buyo Inshi was a bit of a crank, his work frankly has big old man yells at cloud energy, the basic assumption that social morality was fundamentally connected to the individual morality of social leaders was pretty widely shared during the late Tokugawa years. To the extent things were going well, it was because good leaders had been setting the right moral example for those below them, creating a harmonious society. And if you looked at the problems facing Japan in the final decades of feudalism and decided things were not going well, what did that say about the current leadership? And that brings us to a term that's pretty important for understanding how we usually think about the Eijanaika movement, yonaoshi. That term means something like correcting the world. You first see it associated with peasant uprisings in the late 1700s and early 1800s. There are a lot of references in academic literature today to yonaoshi movements, and that plural is important. There was never a centralized movement. Instead, the growing unease and uncertainty of the late Tokugawa period, the economic stagnation, the growing political destabilization, and for peasants in particular, the growing sense of ill use by leadership, led to a fundamental sense that something was wrong with the current social order of the world, and this needed to be fixed. Outright yonaoshi rebellions were of course the most dramatic manifestation of this belief that there was something fundamentally flawed in the system that needed changing. Those rebellions, though, are not terribly well documented. On the government side of things, there wasn't much interest in documenting these movements with any degree of even-handedness, and so they're often just recorded as, in this year there was a rebellion in Village X that was crushed, with maybe a few more sentences of detail. And of course, the rebellions themselves didn't exactly leave a rich documentary trail for us to follow, especially because many of the leaders ended up being executed. We have records of 5 rebellions where there's some surviving detail about what it is the rebels wanted, but there's no reason to believe the demands of other, less well-documented rebellions varied all that much from these surviving examples. Some demands from Yonaoshi rebels were pretty consistent. Replace the current village officials, confiscate old land records and other village documents, allow smaller cultivators to serve as headmen for villages, not just the wealthiest people in a village. Pawned goods should be redeemed without interest, cash loans should be repaid without interests, leadership of villages should be opened up beyond the small class of extremely privileged hereditary headman families, wealthy peasants handed unaccountable power by feudal lords in exchange for making sure taxes were paid on time. Sometimes these demands could get pretty radical. Total cancellation of all debts, for example, rather than just being allowed to repay them with no interest. But generally one gets the sense that the demands of Yonaoshi, despite the grandiose name, were not actually that world-shaking. The world being corrected wasn't really the whole world, it was the local village, and that makes sense when you think about the way most peasants lived. The political universe of the peasant was not national or even domain-wide, but existed at the village level. It covered their home and the surrounding area. They weren't after sweeping social change. Their universe was fundamentally local. Anything beyond that was not of interest to their lives. There's no apocalyptic, world-changing idea here, just limited goals for the betterment of the community, and even those limited goals usually were not that successful. Some of the rebellions did force some changes, such as the alterations in how headmen were selected in one domain, Aizu, but for the most part these rebellions were brutally crushed by the samurai class and the ringleaders executed for stirring up trouble. Thus, over the decades, the term Yonaoshi became less and less associated with outright rebellion, a pretty dangerous pursuit as we're seeing in the Tokugawa system, and more with indirect criticism. For example, in past episodes, we covered the assassination in 1784 of one Tanuma Okimoto. Okimoto was one of the Wakadoshi Yori, the confusingly named junior elders, who were the second most important group of counselors to the shogun, after the Roju, the elder elders, I guess. Anyway, Tanuma Okimoto was influential both by virtue of his position and because his dad, Tanuma Okitsugu, was one of the elder elders and generally at his time considered to be the most important guy in Japan in the early 1780s. The shogun at the time, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was in his early 20s and not very capable, and everybody knew Tanuma Okitsugu was really calling the shots. And so the widespread rumor at the time was also that Tanuma, who publicly was pushing for reforms to shore up the shogunate, was wildly corrupt, and that corruption was one of the major stated motivations for the assassination of his son. The killer, a low-ranking samurai named Sano Masakoto, left behind a manifesto accusing Tanuma Okimoto, and by proxy his father Okitsugu, of mistreating the common people of Edo to line his own pockets. Whether or not that is actually, true is a bit beyond our scope here. What matters is that while things didn't work out great for the assassin, Sano Masakoto was ordered to commit suicide shortly after the attack and his family property was confiscated, the people of Edo loved him for what he did. Tanuma Okitsugu and his son were not very popular among the people of Edo, who blamed them for rising food prices and general corruption. When, shortly after the assassination, food prices began to fall, people took that as proof that Sano's actions had the blessings of the gods themselves. More likely, of course, this was just a market correction caused by the first good harvest in a long time after a series of bad ones, but you have to admit, the other interpretation is more exciting. And so the people of Edo began to venerate the dead assassin Sano to the point of deifying his spirit at Tokuhonji, a temple in the middle of the Shitamachi, the lower town of Edo that was dominated by the non-samurai. The name they gave his deified spirit was Yonaoshi Daimyojin, very roughly the great god of world renewal. During the final decades of the Tokugawa shogunate, you see this pattern a great deal. Virtuous officials who stood up for the people, headmen who protested against exorbitant taxes even at the risk of their own lives, were deified as Yonaoshi gods, whose actions were proof that heaven favored change in the current system to make things fairer for the little people. That this became the standard form of protest makes sense when you think about the fact that when it came to religion, the shogunate was a bit more hands-off than it was in other sectors of life. You could get away with things if you were doing them to venerate one of the kamis or Buddhas that you couldn't do regularly day to day. And this brings us, at long last, back to the Eiji movement. The most common scholarly interpretation of this rather odd moment in Japanese history is that it was a representation of the same discontent as the earlier Yonaoshi movements, and that in fact the Eiji ideal was that same sort of desire for change, but expressed in a safer context than, say, outright rebellion or deifying the murderer of a local official. As we've seen before, the shogunate and all feudal authorities tended to be pretty hands-off when it came to matters of religion, and so expressing discontent at the system using religion as a vehicle generally was one of your safer options for critique. If it all sounds a bit abstract and academic at this point, consider it this way. You're a townsman in one of Japan's urban centers in the late 1860s. Your life has been turned upside down in the last few years. The foreigners have upended the economic system. Suddenly, just getting by is more expensive than it's ever been before. The government is kind of a train wreck, not that you probably know what a train is. It's unable to really deal with any of these problems. You, meanwhile, can barely figure out what's even happening. There's no real fourth estate, no independent journalists beyond the anonymously circulated Kawaraban newspapers that deal primarily in rumor. So everything you are hearing is rumor that has been pushed through a nationwide game of telephone. As a result, those rumors could get pretty wild. Remember, Kawai Kome recorded stories about the shogun being poisoned or falling out of towers, about foreign conspiracies to destroy Japan, evil Christian wizards enchanting people. It all sounds outlandish, but that's because we have a lot more access to information about what was actually happening than anybody who was not a part of the Tokugawa elite would have had. In that situation, how hard would it really be to buy into the idea that this was some sort of divinely ordained moment of world renewal when the old corrupt order would be swept aside and a newer one brought into being? As Miura Takashi puts it in his book Agents of World Renewal, quote, "Scholars typically highlight the significance of Eiji as a manifestation of the social instabilities of late Tokugawa Japan. Scholars have also characterized Eiji as a poignant expression of popular consciousness of change, a millenarian desire for a new world. Villagers from Awa famously exclaimed during an Eiji celebration, quote, 'It's world renewal for the country of Japan, isn't it grand?'" That's the pretty standard academic take on all of this. If you haven't heard the term millenarianism before, it's a sort of imminent belief in the end of the world, after which will come a new golden age. The second coming of Jesus is the most common form of millenarian worldview today, but there are plenty of others, and some of those are even non-religious. One could spicily argue that the Marxist view of history is a type of secular millenarian religion with a prophecy about a more just world, and that the proletarian revolution is a form of millenarian belief. But that's a whole other subject, and maybe a future episode idea if I ever want to get some very angry emails. Anyway, before I get thoroughly cancelled, the normal way for academics to understand the Eiji movement is precisely as a form of safe protest, so to speak, wrapped in a garb of religious millenarianism, because again, the Tokugawa shoguns were pretty hands-off when it came to anything to do with the gods or Buddhas. In this line of thinking, the crowds of commoners singing and dancing in the streets were essentially just reacting to the instability of the time and their own sense of ill use, because remember, this is all happening from 1867 to early 1868. You're hearing, in rapid succession, The emperor is dead, a new boy emperor is planning to topple the Tokugawa shoguns, the shogun has abdicated, wait, he hasn't abdicated, actually there was a big battle, he seems to have lost. And in this telling, the people are almost sarcastically reacting, the country is falling apart, the foreigners are predating on us, and rice is 8 times the cost it was 10 years ago. Ain't it grand? I don't think that's wrong, certainly one imagines that, for lack of a more concrete term, the vibes were not great during this time, and people were probably looking for ways to express that sense, and their general frustration with how things were going. But this take overlooks something important about the whole Eijanaika movement, the link to religion. I don't think it was just as a way to cover your own rear end and avoid getting in trouble for critiquing the government, and I'm not the only one. Here I want to turn for a second to see how Kawai Kome describes what happens in Wakayama when Eijanaika begins to break out in the region, starting in the 11th lunar month of 1867. First came word in a letter from a family friend in Kyoto. Sacred amulets had begun to fall from the sky. Quote, "In the houses on which the divine images have fallen, they are displaying decorations of bamboo grass, erecting sacred ropes, and making offerings of rice cakes, sake, fish, and sweets. Family members are gathering in the towns, wearing layers of clothes, winter jackets, yuzen silk, and dappled kanoko cloth, all costing 11 or 12 ryo each. Wealthier people are wearing 5 or 6 layers at once. Their bright red clothes cost over 100 ryo. Women are dressing as men as women, and they are behaving in all sorts of strange ways. They are playing flutes, shamisen, and drums, ringing bells, cheering, and dancing as they shout, 'Yoi janaika, yoi janaika.' The sound of their celebration starts around noon and continues around 1 to 3 a.m. By the 7th day of the 12th lunar month, Kome reported amulets falling in Wakayama, and by the 13th, here's what she says in her diary, quote, "In Wakayama Nanachome, sacred papers and images of Daikoku, a fortune god, have been following. The people are drinking sake, and from early evening they can be heard dancing in the streets." So you can see pretty clearly the idea of Eijanaika spreading as news of it spreads from other areas. But what I really want to focus on here are the amulets, something that most academic work on this period for a long time didn't really give much credence to. It must just be a rumor, an excuse. But it's the one thing that's consistent across these movements, more so even than the Eijanaika chant itself. Here, for example, is a letter written to local administrators from Sunpu in modern Shizuoka, on the other end of the Tokaido Road connecting Kyoto to modern Tokyo, from about a month before Kome heard the rumors of amulets falling in Kyoto. Quote, "A talisman of the great illustrious kami of Chiryu has descended on the household of Yasuemon. Therefore we would like to set up an altar with bamboo leaves and make offerings of sake for 7 days. We humbly ask in writing for permission over this matter, the 16th day of the 10th month year of the rabbit, Abe Town, Headman Nozaki Nobutaro." Note, the god in this case is different, Chiryu Daimyojin, a local deity separate from the one Kome reported seeing images of, Daikoku. But the basic narrative is the same. And this, you might have noticed from the tone, is not just a record of what happened, but a request to local officials for permission to hold a celebration. Something else you do see in a lot of records from the Eijanaika movement. Here, for example, is what the samurai diarist Hosono Yosai recorded happening in Nagoya. Quote, "The end of the 8th month, a talisman of Ise fell near the temple town in Jonan. The talisman was enshrined at the house by which it fell after notifying the authorities. Talismans continued to fall in many places in the center of the domain, even toward the end of the 9th month. On the 29th day of the month, the town office received reports of 217 places where talismans had fallen, both kami and Buddhas. Having notified the authorities, the talismans were to be enshrined for 7 days. However, extravagant festivities were prohibited." Putting this all together, you get an interesting picture. Not something that looks like a protest, but something closer to a religious festival. And many of the other details recorded by participants and witnesses match. Here's what Hosono Yosai says happened right after the appropriate space was constructed to house the talismans that fell from the sky. Quote, To enshrine the talismans, a makeshift space was created in front of the building using screens or drapes. Many layers were prepared on the altar. At the front, various offerings were placed, including sake, steamed rice, snacks, vegetables, fruits, and fish. Some households also lined up numerous barrels, presumably of more sake. Fire was lit and the names of the deities were written on lanterns. 2 long bamboos with leaves were erected by the tips of the eaves, and enclosing ropes, shimanawa, were hung. In some houses, lanterns were hung on the eaves, while in others they were hung on separate stands or were constructed consecutively on bamboo branches. Worshippers came by and offered money, so the households prepared offering boxes, but not many did this. A pile of money formed as worshippers threw money directly in front of the kami and Buddhas. These donations of money to the community were also a common marker of festivals, usually an occasion for the wealthy in town to support the needy, particularly because those whose homes were blessed by the talismans were usually expected to share their blessing with the community. Here's how one household in Tage village in Ise recorded their expenses in hosting the village's Ejanaika celebration after a talisman fell near their home. Quote, "We distributed to worshippers about 1.5 bales worth of rice cakes used as offerings. In addition, we also dispersed tangerines, cooked 9 bales of rice, and provided 1 koku and 6 to of sake. In addition, we spent 4 ryo on candles and oil, and about 30 ryo on clothing and other items. In total, we spent about 70 ryo for this celebration." Other gifts were more direct. Matsuura Kozo, a samurai official in what's now Shimada in Shizuoka Prefecture, recorded the wealthy of the city just throwing money from the rooftops during an Ejanaika celebration. And one suspects that talismans were in some cases being planted by the homes of the wealthy deliberately to get them to share their blessings in this way. And this brings us, I think, to the core of what is interesting about this movement. It forces us to think about a historical moment in a way that reminds us of our biggest weaknesses as historians. We were not there. For a modern historian, when we look at Ejanaika or moments like it, there's a tendency to want to fit them into frameworks we understand today. This was a protest, anger at an unfair system. That's a notion we can wrap our heads around. It's rational, it's clear, you can see why people would be mad. Everything fits. But as historians, we have to remember that what makes sense to us is not what would have made sense necessarily to people 1,100 or even 10 years ago. Perspectives change in ways big and small. So yes, anger at the system probably was a part of Ejanaika, the old desire for Yonaoshi given a new form. But we also can't discount the religious angle. For example, if we step back from our modern rationalism for a moment, doesn't it track that people would view a time as topsy-turvy as the final years of the shogunate as somehow the will of the gods, some sort of manifestation of divine disruption to be celebrated or appeased or something? Exactly the kind of moment you might imagine charms falling from the skies and that you would mark with some sort of celebration or ritual or just outlet for the anxiety you're feeling. It all reminds me, in many ways, of something I read in graduate school, a history of the Boxer Rebellion in China by the name History in 3 Keys. That book, by Paul Cohen, is a bit of a historical experiment covering China's Boxer Rebellion in 1900 from 3 different angles, and one of these is the perspective of the Boxers themselves. Dr. Cohen noted that Western narratives of the Boxer Rebellion tended to focus on the political framing, that the peasants of North China were angry at the foreigners in their midst and attacked them because of Western arrogance and imperialism in China. But Dr. Cohen noted that just looking at it this way discounted, the thing that united the Boxers. Not just the idea that the foreigners were a problem, but that religious and martial arts practices could be channeled to give people the spiritual power to beat them. It sounds absurd to a modern audience, and certainly it didn't work, but Dr. Cohen notes that doesn't mean the Boxers didn't believe it. Indeed, it's impossible to explain the rebellion unless they did. Of course, that still leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to Ejanaika. Chief among them, where did the whole amulets falling from the sky thing even originate from? How many people really believed this was what was happening? Why don't we have any amulets that I know of surviving from this moment? All good questions. Might be focused on the wrong things, though. Perhaps what really matters here is simply that people believed enough to want to be a part of the moment. Maybe what matters is remembering the limits of our own understanding of history, knowing that our own perspectives limit us in some ways. And maybe what matters is remembering that when things get a little too out of hand, every so often you just gotta throw your hands up in the air and shout, "Eh Janaika, ain't it grand?" That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network on Patreon. Next week, we're going to have an interview with a good friend, a special guest, and we'll talk a little bit about something different from what we usually do. The week after that, technically episode 601, will stand in for our 600th episode, and it'll be our usual question and answer. This time around, just to keep things manageable for me, questions are going to be open only to folks who are supporters of the show on Patreon. So, thank you to those of you who donate to support the show. As always, I can't say enough how much I appreciate it. I'm really excited to talk through some of the excellent questions you all have shared. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.